Hi, it's Busembo, and today we're going to be discussing on one of the needs that we identified on the previous video, and that was a need for a buy and sell agreement between Mr. King and Mr. Green, because they were involved in a business. So today we're going to delve into how to structure that and what is basically involved from a high level perspective. Let's go. So as a quick recap from the last video, we know that Mr. King is in a business relationship with Mr. Green. They own shares in Zimele Pty Ltd. The company is valued at 10 million rands. Mr. King owns 70% of those shares, which means his value of the business, or his shareholding, is basically valued at 7 million rands. And Mr. Green owns the other 30%, which basically means his value is 3 million rands. Now we assumed that they were in IT business, and Mr. King is also the chief programmer in the company. Now the next thing that we assumed that Mr. King passes away, which means he's no longer the shareholder, or well, his estate is going to have to be wound up, and the company is missing a chief programmer as well. So in the last video, we identified the fact that at this shareholder level, because these two, Mr. Green and Mr. King, are shareholders, if Mr. King passes away, Mr. Green is going to have to buy his shareholding. That's the need that we identified from the last video. He's going to have to buy out that shareholding because Mr. King's estate is going to need to be wound up, and we identified the need there and what the problems could be surrounding that. Now, the problem that we identified is that Mr. Green may not have the actual 7 million rands that is required in order to buy Mr. Green's shareholding out, because it's a private company. I mean, it's not like he's the executive of Mr. King is going to go offer the shares in an open market. So ideally, Mr. Green would like to have 7 million rands, so he buys out Mr. King. And remember, we spoke about that whole issue that in fact Mr. King was also married in community of property, which means indirectly his wife owns half of those shares as well. Now, shares could be sold for a whole host of reasons in a normal course of business. It could be for expansion, for whatever the host is, or new investors are coming in. That's in a normal course of business. But what we were talking about here is a death of Mr. King. So that's not in the normal course of business. That is a shock to the business. And it actually speaks to things like the succession plan of the business. Even financiers and investors, they want to see those kind of succession plans to know that when they're dealing with you, when they're advancing funds to the company, that even if something happens to those shareholders or the individuals that operate the company, that the company, won't suddenly fold or be financially embarrassed, basically. So a possible solution could be to introduce an insurance policy in order to resolve the problem. Now, we know that Mr. Green needs 7 million rands in the event of the death of Mr. King so that he can buy out Mr. King. So by introducing a life policy on the life of Mr. King, Mr. Green will get the funding for that transaction from the insurance policy, which is on the life of Mr. King, and he will get a payout at that stage, at the death of Mr. King, of 7 million rands, which he can then on-pay to the executor of Mr. King in order to buy those shares. So by the introduction of that policy, we've introduced a funding mechanism for Mr. Green. So now we've sorted out the problem of the funding, where Mr. Green is going to get the funds from in order to purchase Mr. King's shares in the event of Mr. King's death. And we've just introduce a life policy, so that's where he's going to get the funding from. However, we need to still have something extra, because that life policy that Mr. Green owns on Mr. King's life is just merely a contract or a separate contract, not merely, but a separate contract between himself and whoever the insurance company is. So when those funds, as a beneficiary or the owner of the policy that Mr. Green has with that insurance company on the life of Mr. King, when those funds pay out, he can do it as he pleases with those funds. We need a contract between now Mr. Green and Mr. King to to manage how those funds are going to be utilized. So we know that in terms of the funding, Mr. Green is going to get the 7 million rands from an insurance policy in the event of Mr. King. So what does that policy look like in terms of structuring it? So the owner of the policy is obviously Mr. Green, because he is the one that needs the funds. The life assured, which is the trigger event, which is the death of Mr. King, is going to have to be obviously Mr. King under the policy. And then the beneficiary, the person that actually needs the funds to come to him, the person that needs those funds is going to be Mr. Green, because he is the person that needs to go and approach the executor of Mr. King in order to buy those 7 million shareholding and then fully own Zimele company. And then obviously the payer of the policy is again going to be Mr. Green. So that's the basic structure of the first policy that Mr. Green would need. Now, I know we're discussing the death of Mr. King at this point, but the converse is obviously could be very true. In the event that Mr. Green dies, Mr. King might not have the liquid cash or the funds to purchase his shareholding, the 3 million rands that Mr. Green has. So because we don't know who will die first, they might enter into an agreement where either of them, whoever dies first, the other one just purchases the other one's shareholding. So before the death of Mr. King would have also taken out a policy on the life of Mr. Green. So in terms of the roles on the second policy, before Mr. King dies, he would have taken out a policy as the owner of the policy. So that's him there, Mr. King. And then the life assured would have been Mr. Green, because we're trying to have 3 million rands pay out in the event of Mr. Green's death to Mr. King as the beneficiary, because he is the person that needs to approach Mr. Green's executor in order to buy those shares, and he will be paying for that policy. So that's the basic structure. So the roles are basically inverse now. So if Mr. Green takes out a policy on the life of Mr. King, as the owner of that policy, he has full rights and obligations under that policy, which means if Mr. King has allowed to be the life assured under the policy, it doesn't mean that 2 years later or whatever the case may be, if he wants to stop being a life assured, he can change things under the policy or cancel the policy or do anything under the policy. He's just the life assured. He's the trigger person for when a payment actually happens. And in our case, we're looking at a life event. So as the owner of the policy, Mr. Green controls everything that happens basically below here. He can cancel the policy, he can change beneficiaries, he can stop paying premiums, whatever the case may be. And also importantly, because this is a separate policy that Mr. Green has with the insurer, whoever the insurer could be, that means as a beneficiary under this policy, if the insured event happens, Mr. King passes away, as a beneficiary, he can do as he pleases with that 7 million rands that pays out to him. So he's not obliged by anything at this stage to say, well, I need to go and use the 7 million rands to go and purchase Mr. King's shareholding in the company. He could determine, for example, that, you know what, I actually don't like this company anymore, and I've got 7 million rands in my pocket. Let's just can the company. So he's got full access to the 7 million rands as the owner. He controls the policy, and he's the beneficiary of the policy. Now, Mr. King will be more than happy to become the life assured on the policy that Mr. Green owns in his life, but something needs to tie him in. He needs to be able to be assured that those funds will be used to purchase his shares, because remember, Mr. King still has a wife and a minor daughter, so he wants that 7 million rands to come into his estate so that he can distribute accordingly in terms of his will or whatever. So Mr. King needs to tie in Mr. Green to say, I know that we are doing this for the sake of you raising or having financing in the event of my death. However, I need to be comfortable that you're going to use those funds to purchase my shares. So therefore, in comes the actual contract between Mr. Green and Mr. King. So now what we can introduce is what we generally call a buy buy and sell agreement or contract or whatever. So now what this agreement is going to say is, when Mr. Green receives those funds from the insurance company, he is obligated by virtue of the buy and sell agreement that he on pays them to the executor so that he can purchase those shares. Otherwise, Mr. Green, as the owner of the policy, remember, at this stage, he can just take those funds and buy a Ferrari if he wants. He can spend those funds as he needs. So this is a separate contract. We'll just call it contract number one. That's just to create the funding for the transaction in the event of Mr. King's death. But then the second contract that we need is a contract that actually manages those funds, and in our case, for purposes of buying the shares of Mr. King from his estate. So just in terms of the benefits of having a buy and sell agreement, you can see some of the benefits, and by no means is this list exhaustive, just some of the main ones on top of my head, is that it preserves the value of the business, in that should Mr. King die, now the business doesn't have to come up with 7 million rands, because the executive of Mr. King is going to say, well, he owns shares for 7 million rands. Does the company have 7 million rands? Does anybody have 7 million rands? Because I need to wind up Mr. King's estate. So the business doesn't have to be put into that financial burden. So it preserves the value of the business, because if the business has to be wound up, it will never fetch the 10 million rand price, because it would be basically not being be sold as a going concern. You'll be basically just selling furniture and whatever else they have in there. The contract could easily be taken over by competitors. So there's a lot of things that you want the business not to be exposed to. Secondly, it also preserves the value for the actual deceased estate as opposed to the business. Now remember, if Mr. King owned these shares and they're worth 7 million rands, now he's got heirs, he's got a wife, and he's got a minor daughter as well. Now, should he pass away, now he wants that hard-earned value, that the business that he started, to be enjoyed by his heirs, by his wife. So he needs that 7 million rands to come back into his estate. Hence, we're going into buy and sell agreement, where we say Mr. Green will then will not offer, but will agree to purchase Mr. King's shares in the event of his death. So that preserves the estate of the deceased as well. In our case, Mr. King. Number three, very important, it offers a funding mechanism for Mr. Green. Now, for Mr. Green, in the event of Mr. King dying, he could have, like we said in the previous video, he could try and raise funds somewhere else, but that depletes his asset, because he might have to use his current asset that he has, or might have to make a loan. Whereas if it's coming from a cheap mechanism, like such as a life policy, he's actually getting a better funding mechanism, which is far cheaper. And then obviously it's a succession plan for the business, like I mentioned before. Investors, creditors, and so on, customers, they're very interested in what's going to happen, and when something happens to the death of a shareholder. Then obviously at the end of the day, it gives you economic growth. There's nothing more important than having our businesses being very sustainable. So we don't want to have events such as a death event completely put the business out of the economic activity. Now, I know we've been talking about death, but it just to simplify the video as an introduction for now. But the other thing we could have done is to obviously have added disability cover, so that if Mr. King got disabled, that a disability benefit pays out, so that Mr. Green can buy him out as well. But for now, we just used a death as an example. Now, guys, there's so much to talk about. I mean, for now, we've just been discussing just the overview of what a buy and sell agreement is, and what the need is, and what it tries to satisfy. And we literally just trimmed right at the top by introducing two contracts, for example, the life policy and the actual buy and sell agreement. Now, there's a whole host of other things that needs to be looked at still. Like, for example, what does Mr. King's will say? You don't want Mr. King and Mr. Green getting into a buy and sell agreement where they agree what happens to the shares, but then Mr. King's will, on the other hand, talks about, well, I'll leave my shares to my daughter, or to my trust, or to my wife, or whatever the case may be. So these documents got to tie in nicely together. Things like your memorandum of incorporation. So there's a lot of things that we're going to still go into, but for now we were just looking at the high level structure of a basic buy and sell agreement, focusing really on what the need is. I mean, it gets all fancy later on when shareholders are not even natural persons. It could be trusts, there could be companies, and there's a whole lot of tax implications that come with that as well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. That was a snapshot of buy and sell agreements, a very simple example. And we'll go into a bit more details, tax implications and so on. And while we introduce the other business assurance needs that we spoke about, such as contingent liability and key man insurance, still running with the Mr. Green and Mr. King scenario. So I'll see you next time. Thanks.